how important to you is personal freedom, and how do you think silver ties into that?
Well, like you mentioned, it is closely related, where I think what brings a lot of people into silver is studying the government, studying the Federal Reserve, and seeing how you have more control and more inflation at the same time, which obviously is not a very pleasant combination. I left for Mexico mid last year, so I've been here about a year and a half, and it's certainly nice where you feel less oppressiveness than what I felt sometimes in the U.S., and certainly that I think a lot of us Americans have been surprised to see the way the Canadian government has turned out. We always thought they were our friendly, happy neighbors up north, and so those are things that I think people are really concerned about now. I wonder if we've actually seen what things will look like, because we have central bank digital currencies being tested right now. You have obviously the policies with the pandemic over the past year that I think were pretty shocking to people, and it almost, to me, changed the rules of what you really thought was possible over these last couple of years. And that was a big part of me leaving, of not wanting to be forced to do something about what I put into my body or not. So along with that, silver and gold, to tie that back in, a means of taking something out of the system and having protection against that financially. And I think there's a lot of people that come down to Mexico for those same reasons and go different places. You mentioned our friend Ladislas, who helps people relocate around the globe. And I mean, it's all going to be a personal preference thing. I mean, some people are more concerned about these things than others, and I know you're having a blast over there in Croatia and think you may have found the perfect spot. And I think there's pros and cons to everywhere. Some people are concerned because here in Mexico you see people driving around in camouflage and they have machine guns, and that makes some people feel uncomfortable. So I think there's differences, whether there's a perfect spot except for the one that you found. That's going to vary person to person, yet it's been nice to be here and at least see a different way of life and how things go. There's parts of me that sometimes misses the U.S., and I hope things don't continue to escalate there, because I'd like to be able to go back there at some point. But so far it's been nice being down here in Mexico, and not as much oppression at times as what we've seen in some other places.
Yeah, and shout out to Ladislas Maurice, the wandering investor. We were talking to him talking about him before we went live, and his channel's very underrated. And he put it interestingly when I asked him the same question. He said, look, personal freedom is not necessarily for everyone. Some people are happy living under certain government rules and regulations, and that's fine for them. Others aren't, and there's always a give and take, right? There's no perfect solution. There are only trade-offs, as Thomas Sowell has said. So, if you want to go to a place with individual freedoms, you might have some downsides in other areas. I spoke at the top of the show before we went on camera, I spoke about how I thought Croatia for me was the perfect place. But, it's less convenient than in the West. You everything shuts down early on Sundays. Stores close randomly. It's tougher to find certain things that you could find back home. But just for me, I mean, I was willing to go anywhere where there was personal freedom. So very happy to find here. You did touch on central bank digital currencies, and I wanted to shift to that next, because according to an article on Decrypt, and you mentioned it as well, mainstream financial institutions in the US are working with the Federal Reserve to test a digital currency platform. So how much of a threat do you think CBDCs are, and do you think that the government could actually be successful in rolling out and implementing it?
Well, I guess I'll preface this with saying that there's a lot we're going to find out, and to some degree it's a guess right now, although I've heard that a friend of mine who was recently in England, he mentioned how they're pretty well advanced. He tried to go to the supermarket and they were asking for his digital ID. So is this something that everyone is forced to opt into? Does it get to the point where just to buy food you have to have the microchip? I sure hope not. It seems like they're moving forward. Again, it was a 12-week test program that the Fed is conducting right now. To what degree are we going to be forced to use that? Can you stay outside of that? Does the supermarket require you to use that? I hope not. The idea that you have that social credit score where if you're buying too much of one product, then they shut it down, or that your money just expires if you don't spend it within a certain period of time. There's certainly some scary precedents. My guess is that in the end it comes down to how much people fight back or resist against that. If everyone just lines up and says, hey, this sounds great, give me mine, then probably will be easier to push that through. Yet if people are resistant to that, I think there's some boundaries to what these governments are able to do, and in ways that it might not always seem like that when people band together and stand up, it doesn't necessarily need a majority of everyone on the same page, but just with a little resistance sometimes can foil some of these schemes. So I hope that's the way that it goes, and again, we'll see over time, but certainly concerning some of the things that you see associated with these projects.
Now, we all want, those of us in the precious metals community, all want to return to sound money in one form or another. And I want to ask you that question. I also asked it to Rafi Farber, your friend who you've also had on your show. What is your idea of a return to sound money? Would it actually be bartering using silver coins and small denominations of gold? Would it be a silver and or gold-backed currency, a gold-backed token on the blockchain? Or how do you see a return to sound money?
Well, perhaps a simple ideal would be something like what the dollar used to represent, where the dollar came along so that we don't have to shave off our gold nuggets, and you have something that's more divisible using the silver and the coins, that there was something actually backing it, which made it harder to just print money at will for whatever policy that the current folks in power advocate. And given that we were doing that really before you had all of the computer technology that we have today, seems like something that would be feasible. And just the idea of preventing that inflation that has made everything so expensive over these past decades in particular. I was reading something recently where they were mentioning how back in the 60s and 70s, you could have one person out working. You didn't need to have 2 or 3 jobs. A house was affordable, so you could go do your craft, buy a house, have a place to live, have time to enjoy being with your family. And now it's getting really difficult for a lot of people out there, which I think is quite unfortunate. So that, to me, the main ideal that I would hope for is that going forward we have something where it's not constantly prices getting jacked up. And I mean, we see these rates of inflation in different countries and food prices just getting out of control for a lot of people, I think is quite unfortunate. Now, in terms of how it may play out, especially if some of these central bank digital currencies are a bigger portion of what we have going forward, that could force us into bartering stuff with silver. And I hope that that's not what it has to come to, but there is that possibility out there. And fortunately, I guess the one advantage that we do have with the blockchain is that you do have the technology to have something that's actually backed. There's projects like Kinesis and others that are already using something like that, where there's a finite amount of stored gold and silver relative to the currency that's being used. So I think there's the technology available. There's certainly people like you and I, and perhaps a lot of the folks watching this, that are in favor of that. And hopefully that's something that we will head more towards. Obviously, the governments will probably be pushing in the other direction, as is often the case, but certainly it would be nice to get more towards something that's more equitable, that rather than the government or the banks being able to just pull large chunks of wealth out, and in the end you have the prices of everything going up so darn much.